This is ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over. As we head into Christmas week, we have 7, as in the Feast of Seven Fishes, 7 stories that we're highlighting for you today. The first truly is biblical, something right out of Cecil B. DeMille's great motion picture, The Ten Commandments. Imagine the scene, which featured locust. The scene is Madagascar. Madagascar, the island, not the animated cartoon. Madagascar, which has been visited by a plague, a real plague, of the Malagasy locust. The United Nations Food and Organization, the UNFNA, has been spending a good deal of money trying to eradicate this migratory locust, which is eating up rice and corn crops. They now report great success using helicopters to get rid of the locust, a bigger bug to scare away the smaller bugs. But the UN Agricultural Organization tells the UN headquarters here in New York that it needs $17 million to spare the island from further infestation and to carry out its helicopter bug scaring big bug program. No word so far from UN headquarters if they're going to help the island, made so famous by the cartoon, Madagascar, get rid of its infiltration. Speaking of biblical images, there's been a feeding frenzy going on in New York. Devyani Khobrade, the 39-year-old Indian consul, the deputy consul, the person who issues the visas and takes care of various consular activities at the United Nations and in New York for India, has been arrested for lying, for saying that she was hiring a woman to clean her house at $4,600 a month, when in fact she was paying her $573 a month, which works out, given a 40-hour week, to $3, which is below minimum wage. And she managed to fudge the reason she was filling out a visa to bring the woman from India to the United States. There have been protests. People holding up signs saying Devyanti was arrested. She was humiliated to bring down and make ashamed all Indians. Nonsense, foolishness. First of all, the U.S. Attorney General for the Southern District of New York is from South Asian heritage. Second of all, consul generals are covered by the 1961 and 1963 Geneva Agreements and consular agreements when they're performing consular duties. They're not like diplomats all the time. And what she did was what we find too many diplomats at the United Nations headquarters doing, lying and cheating to make their life in the expensive New York City easier. Recently, there have been accounts of diplomats from the Russian mission who've had babies on the tab of the U.S. taxpayer. This is a young woman, a 39-year-old woman, exploiting another young woman from India for the purposes of cheap domestic labor. Maids deserve more than $3.20 an hour for working in New York. They've got to eat and live here too. It's got little to do with humiliating Indians. It's got a lot to do with humiliating people who do jobs less desirable than the ones that most of us perform every day, like making beds, sweeping up, and things like that. All the hullabaloo, all the Indian efforts back in New Delhi to take away the security surrounding, that may have been an earthquake brought on by New Delhi's reaction in that camera shake. All the taking away of security barriers around the U.S. Mission in New Delhi is simple silliness. This is a woman who is trying to live large by acting small. The end of the year brings Vladimir Putin's annual marathon press conference. This year, the man who likes to rip off his shirt and show what a macho figure he is talked for more than 4 hours. He explored a whole range of issues. And then at the end, he said that he was going to free Mikhail Borisovich Khodorkovsky, the man who has sat in the Gulag for 10 years. Khodorkovsky almost immediately left his Gulag labor camp number 7, to be precise, in Karelia, the region that borders Finland and is cold and beautiful. Got on a private jet and flew to Germany, where Hans Dietrich Gensler, the man who had done so much for German-Russian relations and helped so much in making the two Germanys come together, greeted him at the airport. Mikhail Borisovich Khodorkovsky has been a political prisoner because he seemed to pose a threat to Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin, who's been showing himself off on the world stage large and strong for a while, helping with the Syrian chemical issue, finding a way, maybe he struck a very bad economic bargain to provide cheap credits and cheap gas to Ukraine. He's got a national and international festival of world peace and love coming up. It's called the Sochi Olympics. And ahead of that, there's a general amnesty. He let Khodorkovsky out early. Khodorkovsky was scheduled to get out in August. I think Khodorkovsky did a smart thing in getting out of the country while he could. The young women from Pussy Riot, the rock punk performance group that staged a 40-second protest that would not have been out of line in some kind of yippie act of street theater in San Francisco years ago, are going to be freed, and so are the Greenpeace activists. Vladimir Putin is not turning warm and fuzzy. He's turning a good diplomatic public relations face to the world, and he's trying to push Russia back onto the center stage, which makes him terribly popular at home. And he also is sending out lifelines all around the world in unexpected directions. Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin leader, has surprised people at the press conference, talking about spying as a necessary profession, along with another oldest profession which he wouldn't mention, and said that what the NSA was doing and what Mr. Obama is doing in America, listening in on everyone's phone conversations, was a necessary thing. An endorsement from a former spy master in East Germany who worked with the Stasi may not exactly be the best endorsement that Mr. Obama's Democratic, liberal, progressive friends want to hear. But then again, Putin is not in the business of making friends. He's in the business of making a point. Russia's back, and the world needs to deal with it. Whether Russia's dealing with the world will be as soft, cuddly, and amnesty-minded after the Olympics are over still is an open question. Syria. Syria, there's some good news to report. First of all, the nuns, the 6 Greek Orthodox nuns who disappeared after their village north of Damascus was taken over by Muslim freedom fighters, terrorists, label them what you will. After their area was contested in the Civil War and fell into hands that were less than sympathetic to their Christian mission, have shown up to be safe and sound and have been relocated to another region, and we expressed some concern for them on a previous edition of Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over, and we're glad to hear they're safe. Less safe are the negotiations to begin a round of peace talks coming out of Geneva that will involve the United States, Russia, Germany, France, England, China, mostly the United States and Russia. Today, we learned that the contentious issue of should Iran be a participant in these talks is still a point of no agreement between the United States and Russia. Obviously, Iran does have interests in Syria, is a backer of some of the Syria warlordism, and is involved in many ways in the Middle East. We'll see what happens. Serious players need to play big-time politics, and Iran is a serious player, but maybe not in the league of the United States and Russia, at least right now. We also have learned that at the end of the year, 11,420 children have died as a result of the Syrian war. That comes as a product of a United Nations report. We also know, as a result of a United Nations report, if you read the documents about the chemical warfare inspection very closely, especially the appendix, we know that the hexadrine chemical is now being traced, precursor to sarin gas, and the only one who has that in Syria, despite the denials of the Bashar Assad regime and the denials of the Russians, are the Bashar al-Assad regime. And eventually, when war crime trials do come, somebody is going to be found guilty of using deadly sarin gas. More hopefully, in Syria, in the coming days, an extraordinary coalition of international partners, led by the United States and Russia, are going to be taking what remains of the storehouse of weapons, chemical weapons in Syria, bringing them to a port city. The Americans are providing the containers. The Russians are providing armored cars. The Chinese are providing 10 ambulances to stand by. They're also providing video surveillance equipment. The Finns are providing standby medical assistance in case something goes wrong, goes wrong, goes wrong. Anything could go wrong, go wrong, go wrong. The Norwegians and the Danes are providing 2 boats that are going to ferry the weapons to Italy, where they're going to be handed over in their containers. On the one hand, the most toxic materials are going to go on a United States ship, where they're going to be destroyed at sea under an experimental hydrolysis regime. The chemicals that can be only dangerous when they're combined, a part A with a part B, are going to be transported to Great Britain for destruction under intensive heat. So we have the following countries making the world safer for chemical weapons: Great Britain, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Russia, the United States, and Syria. That's 7 different countries working on one key problem, a problem that is being solved thanks to the power politics of the United States threatening and the diplomatic skills of Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin implementing a way out of a crisis about chemical warfare in the 21st century. In addition to this, we find that there are problems plaguing what Joseph Conrad called the heart of darkness, the heart of Africa. Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over has spoken at some length about the problems in the so-called Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now we shift our focus to the Central African Republic, which is on the brink of a civil war, where bloodshed is a daily occurrence, where Samantha Power, the new United Nations ambassador from the United States, herself a respected journalist who has written about the problem from hell, the problem of dealing with Rwanda, has gone to visit. In fact, she's gone to visit. She may be in Africa more than she has been at United Nations headquarters since she took up her ambassadorship. She has not been a presence here on a daily basis conducting UN work. She's been more in touch with the Obama administration's foreign policy making apparatus in Washington, but that's fine, because with Rosemary DiCarlo, we know that United Nations work of the United States is in extremely capable hands. Ms. Powers is in the Central African Republic, where 600,000 people have been displaced by a war that pits, it pits Christians against Muslims. It pits people who are insecure in a state that is very insecure against the promises of the United Nations to help them. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has called for a blue helmet force of 6,000 to 9,000 United Nations warriors, peacekeepers, call them what you will, to restore some measure of stability. Whether that's going to happen remains to be seen. There's the Salika Muslim forces that are fighting against the Balakla Christian forces. In the middle of this monstrous storm of instability and destruction, the UN ambassador from the United States, Samantha Power, has gone. She's been declaiming the chaos that is swirling around. She said in a notable statement, "There is a tyranny of the mob that has taken hold here that is horrific in its own right, but is also something that can be hard to stop once it's been unleashed. There is a tyranny of the mob that has taken hold here." Mobs are irrational. How do rational actors undo the action of a mob? Ambassador Powers has pledged some $15 million in American support to try and help things out. How much the United States is going to back other measures, back Ban Ki-moon's desire to bring up to 9,000 troops in to secure the peace in that part of the world, remains to be seen. And in another troubled part of that region, in the heart of darkness, in the world's very newest country, South Sudan, more chaos threatens. The President of the United States has said that they are on the brink of disaster, that United Nations, which suffered the loss of UNMISS, that's the name of the UN peacekeeping mission in southern Sudan, UNMISS, like a single woman of the UN, UNMISS. 3 Indian blue helmet soldiers were killed this week. The rivalry between the Dinka tribe and the Nuer tribe is threatening to totally destabilize the country. 500 people have been killed in the last week, 700 wounded, 20,000 are seeking shelter at UN refugee camps. The United States is sending in 45, mostly Marines, I would think, 45 U.S. military personnel to secure the safety of American diplomats there. This, no doubt, in the wake of what went on in Benghazi, where there were not enough Marines to guard the American diplomats who were on very hazardous duty. President Obama has said southern Sudan is on the precipice not of civil war, but of total chaos. Whether anything can be done to relieve this chaos is a big question. It would be interesting to know if Ambassador Powers is going to go from one hot spot, Central Africa, to another hot spot in Central Africa, instead of the Central African Republic, down to southern Sudan, the baby state that was part of a civil war for some 20 years, which just broke away and established itself, and which is having tremendous problems in becoming a civilized part of the world. An advocate of greater stability in that part of the world, George Clooney, issued a statement, and he said, "The United Nations could play the most critical role in containing the crisis in southern Sudan. There is much international hand-wringing and regret that not much can be done when violence is so quickly escalating. But recent examples in Congo and the Ivory Coast demonstrate that when a UN force on the ground is buttressed with a more robust mandate and greater international support, very positive outcomes are possible. And the recent international mobilization to respond to the conflict in the Central African Republic shows that when political will is generated, military assets can be deployed quickly in defense of civilians." Part of this poses a larger problem. The United Nations in the Democratic Republic of the Congo finally has authorized the use of offensive action by its soldiers. But except in extreme cases, is the United Nations the right vehicle for using troops to bring order, not to maintain the peace, but to go to war? We know that UN troops in Mali have recently exceeded their authority and killed civilians, shot at civilians. What Clooney is advocating seems logical, seems positive. But the United Nations needs to have a long, purposeful, philosophical debate. Yes, after many years of action of blue helmets keeping the peace, they've changed their tune. But how much are they willing to tolerate in the deaths of UN soldiers? What are the limits of activities before specifics happen? These need to be debated. And finally, as we end the year, we know that more than 100 journalists were killed throughout the world covering world events this year. 19 or 20 were killed in Syria. Again, Syria is the leading place for deadly action against journalists. Journalists are being tracked. Journalists are being assassinated. Journalists are being captured and tortured in Syria. Yes, this year there were 21 fewer journalists killed than the preceding year, but that's not the good news. Syria is number one on the places most deadly for journalists practicing their profession and craft and their business of informing the world. But the other places on the world horror scale for journalists are both supposedly democracies. India, with 13 dead journalists, and the Philippines, with 13 dead journalists. Ideology and anti-freedom of expression actions are not synonymous. As we head into 2013, we know there will be many, 2014, out of 2013. We know that there will be many more issues bubbling under and bubbling over around the world. But if we don't have journalists out there telling us what's going on, we only have rumors, videos posted on YouTube, and gossip. The world needs to be safer for journalists as we enter a new year, the 14th year of a new millennium. For ICAStNews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City, for Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over as we bubble into a new year, I'm Jonathan Sanders.